With Beethoven's Sonata in A-flat major, Opus 110, we come to late Beethoven. And with that, we enter uncharted territory, not approached before or possibly since. All composers evolve, and many improve as they mature, though some, like Mendelssohn, appear to have been at their best when still young prodigies, and others, like Rossini, drop out in middle age when the going is good. Beethoven, though, presents a special case, for his style changed so markedly over time. Musicians generally divide his works into early, middle, and late style periods, though those accepted divisions are approximate at best. Nevertheless, few would disagree that Opus 110, written in 1821 when Beethoven was 51 years old, is a totally different animal than Opus 2, number 1, written in 1795 when he was 25. Whereas Opus 2, number 1, his first published piano sonata, has brethren among its ancestors by other classical period composers, Opus 101, 106, 109, 110, and 111, the late piano sonatas, stand alone with the late string quartets in their daring range and power. The challenge is to define what makes for that aloneness, and people have been trying for a very long time now. I started out by writing that they'd been trying for 2 centuries, but I realized that wasn't quite true, since in his own day, Beethoven's late works were seen as bizarre and explicable only as the infirmities of a deaf man. It is perhaps worth taking a moment to hypothesize about the connection between Beethoven's deafness and his late style. Beethoven's terror of his increasing deafness reached its peak in 1802 already, when he wrote the letter known now as the Heiligenstadt Testament, in which he despaired about his inability to hear even the flute of a shepherd and admitted that he'd contemplated suicide. By his later years, his conversations took place through a, quote, conversation book, and the story, apocryphal perhaps, is that he conducted deaf, unable to hear even the applause that followed a performance of his Ninth Symphony. Surely such isolation in a hidden world, unable to hear either speech or music, would have a profound effect on one's inner hearing and thinking, allowing for sounds, harmonies, forms never before imagined. In his late works, sonata form gets stretched and compressed and generally bent out of shape. In Opus 101, it becomes so concise as to make the form nearly unrecognizable. And in Opus 106, it becomes so vast as to dwarf all previous sonatas. Modulations, or key changes, can be wildly unorthodox. Extremes of register and dynamic and tempo become commonplace, and disparate ideas butt up right against each other. Movements permeate one another as the architectural vision grows larger and larger, and the weight of the work moves away from the first movement and into the last. Those last 2 attributes remind me of a massive novel I read recently, The Man Without Qualities, by the Austrian author Robert Musil. I persisted because every few pages, Musil said something that really resonated with me, thus making up for the pages in between, of which there were admittedly a few too many. In this case, Musil talked about how we search for a chronology and a narrative as we go through life, a story to tell which makes sense of the randomness of events. He says, quote, "The impression that life has a course is the refuge from chaos, and this is the trick the novel turns to account." I think that's what Beethoven turns to account as well, and very explicitly connecting the separate movements of a single piece, as well as moving the largest movement to the end, makes that narrative yet more compelling. Beethoven is always interested in navigating across contradictions and embracing opposite poles. That's what gives the music such a vast emotional range. He does it across sonatas, and he does it within sonatas. Listen to the opening of Opus 101. Now listen to the opening of Opus 111. and I'm going to play the opening of the exposition after the introduction. Those are two very different creatures. I think I'd choose 101 as my therapist and 111 as my lawyer in a very tough case. But listen now to the second movement of Opus 111. That's who I'd choose as my God. There's a vastness there that seems to embrace the cosmos. Now listen to the opening of Opus 109, because in this sonata, he moves from one state to another, not just between movements, but within the first 9 bars. It's that absolute determination to wrest contradictions into unity, to be all-encompassing, both compositionally and emotionally, but to nevertheless create a refuge from chaos rather than a disjointed muddle that makes this art so extraordinarily powerful. That's how it makes sense out of our lives. The sonata we're discussing today, Opus 110, has its own overriding narrative. It starts from a place of innocence in the first movement, and it moves to brisk, fierce austerity mixed with humor in the second. Then in the last, a vast double construct of slow to fast, it goes through a period of grief, moves on to a rigorous fugue, disintegrates, and is finally reborn. This is a life story that ends in redemption. We'll deal with the first movement in this lecture, and we'll start with the exposition, where Beethoven lays out all the materials that he'll be molding together. I'm going to assume that the glory of the melody speaks for itself, but it's worth talking about a couple of other amazing aspects that are a little less obvious. One is the sheer number of disparate ideas that Beethoven introduces in a very short movement. The more there are, the harder it is to build that necessary coherent narrative. And that's where the novel or composition has to diverge from real life. Nothing can be random, nothing unrelated to what came before or after. The evidence of Beethoven's voluminous sketchbooks is ample testimony to how well he knew that obligation. Still, there are many ways to meet that obligation and to create a cogent structure. It can be jagged, as in Opus 109. Remember that crash landing from the first theme to second theme, where unity of tempo underwent a frontal assault. There was no pretense of easing in from this to this. Or it can be smooth, as in Opus 110, where the regularity of the pulse is paramount. Here's a very secure place where we begin. We'll call it theme A. It's harmonized simply, and it consists of a chain of fourths. You'll want to remember that sound, because that chain of fourths becomes the subject of the later fugue. You'll also want to recognize that opening falling third here from C to A flat, as well as the rising sixth, which follows it. It will sound like this. Because both permeate the movement. Here they are immediately in the next theme. We'll call it theme B, which is independent, but very closely related. It shares key, mood, tempo, and intervals with theme A. Let me play it. It's filled with thirds, and it ends with the same traversal from A flat up a sixth to F as theme A did. Here are a few of those thirds. Both directions. Up again. And that opening traversal from A flat to F started here on the A flat. We got the B flat, and we're gonna then head all the way up to F. F. And again, all the way from C, D, E flat, F. And the end of that second part of the first theme, theme B, goes from A flat, we go to a C, a D flat, E flat, F. So in both cases, you hear this. Just in different rhythms. This theme is again harmonized simply, and it goes straight to the heart. It's all sung. I think that one of its most striking aspects is its accompaniment. The regular 16th notes beneath this melody go a long way toward conveying its wisdom. It has a support system that's unwavering and utterly reliable. In fact, 16th notes are the glue that hold this movement together. Sometimes they provide serenity, sometimes propulsion, and sometimes flotation. But their rhythm is a constant, while their divergence in harmony, articulation, and function is infinitely rich. Listen to all the themes that depend on them. Here's the one you heard first, when they're in the service of a beautiful melody. Then the next instance, bare, high up, and with the two hands speaking in imitation of one another. Then another, this one angry. The hands are now at war, tugging in opposite directions and at maximum distance from each other as they navigate the full range of the keyboard, each one independently outlining the interval of a sixth that previously seemed so kindly. Here's the sixth. Every step is an effort and filled with resistance. And finally, the last, the hands at peace with one purpose and content to reinforce a stable harmony. That's most of the themes of the movement, and it's a lot of themes for a short movement. There is a foil, however. There's a part C of the first theme, and it occurs right after parts A and B, those gentle opening melodies. It takes the simple harmonic underpinnings of the beginning and literally flies with them. The 16ths disappear, the melody gives way, and we get a passage entirely in 30-second notes that's purely about texture and register. It sounds like this. That passage reminds me of Shakespeare's poet's pen that gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Beethoven is interested here in traversing large swaths of the keyboard, untethered. We're dealing with matter that is unweighted, as if all the ropes that tied it to earth were suddenly released. It's the movement's first, but not last, inkling of Beethoven's obsession with great height and great depth. That sense of freely floating, as if the keyboard were one great galaxy, occurs often in this sonata. It's a release from the laws of gravity, and it works both up and down. It gives a foretaste of our painful descent to G minor later in the sonata, and then of our triumphant rise back up to A flat. So let me play you the whole exposition, and that will take us right up to a memorable airborne moment. Usually, the end of the exposition is marked by a big cadence and a repeat sign. That repeat sign with its two vertical bars gives a good visual portrayal of the stop we need to observe before starting up again. It's a red light, but not in this piece. I'm reminded here of a phenomenon in St. Louis where I grew up. There aren't many stop and go lights, and the only people who actually stop at stop signs are high school students taking driver ed. Everyone else prides themselves on having mastered what's known familiarly as the St. Louis rolling stop, which essentially means you slow down and then you glide right through. That's what Beethoven does at the end of the exposition. There's no repeat sign in sight. Instead, we've now arrived at what to me is one of the most magical moments of the piece. The stable 16ths we just encountered have disappeared. They've floated upwards and are now so unencumbered that their weightlessness lets them dissipate altogether. And now we roll right through that missing stop sign between exposition and development. This is the moment that makes one gasp at Beethoven's temerity. We're falling through emptiness. No sixteenths, sheer octaves, no harmonies for support, no clear modulatory mechanism. This modulation could not be more abrupt. It's accomplished through magic rather than logic. There's another quote, this time from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, that I can't resist sharing here. And in the nights, the heavy earth is falling from all the stars down into loneliness. We are all falling, and yet there is one who holds this falling endlessly gently in his hands. So Beethoven is holding us gently. And now we find ourselves in F minor with our beloved accompanying sixteenths back again, this time in the service of theme A. This was theme A in the original, and now we're in F minor. Beginning of the development is thus begins a brief but memorable development section, which, like the recapitulation, brings together disparate ideas, just as Musil's narrative ties together random events. The drama centers on the left-hand sixteenths. Soon they take on an independent life. They're no longer simply cushions upon which a beautiful melody rests, but are intricately curving scale figures, highlighting the low registers of the instrument in well-delineated tenor and bass voices. They're on a search. The tenor asks the question, the bass answers, always in measured tones, neither hurrying nor hesitating. Answered by that commentary, weaving a spoken counterpoint around the familiar theme, imparts a new multi-layer quality to the music, and we explore one key after another, moving down by thirds. When at the end, B-flat minor melts into A-flat major, we enter the recapitulation. The sixteenths give way to the flying 30 seconds that are now an accompaniment rather than a separate theme. The return washes over us, and we feel immensely grateful. Let me play you the development into the recapitulation. That return is infinitely reassuring because it brings back the tonic key and it centers us in the middle of the keyboard, exactly where we began. But most importantly, it unites those two previously independent ideas that we called themes A and C. It creates a synthesis, a sense of progress that provides a marker in our tale. Here was A, and here was C. Originally, progress has been made, but this can't be the end. There's no late Beethoven that stays in the center of the keyboard for long or settles so easily for reconciliation. Here, the 30 seconds gradually rise into the right hand, ending in a veritable cry of unrelenting high A flats. Beethoven knows that anything outside of a normal vocal range conveys angst, and this repetition pounds. That cry carries us to our familiar theme B, and though its faithful 16th note accompaniment is intact, it's in the wrong key, D flat major. We have to get back to the home key of A flat. That's the non-negotiable imperative of a recapitulation in classical sonata form. But how we get back there is unprecedented. Beethoven seems to have been determined that modulation in this piece will take place through sleight of hand rather than approved procedure. Tune B, so very full-throated in its first appearance, gradually becomes frailer and frailer, and as it gets softer, it also begins to fall, eventually landing very, very strangely in E major, the wrong destination. This is a wonderful modulation, playing on the most magical aspect of harmony, the fact that one note can be two notes. D flat is suddenly C sharp, and once that transformation has taken place, we have access to a whole new set of related keys. So here, this note is D flat. And here it's C sharp. We have to get back eventually, though. And here's where the uncanny is most apparent. Let me lead you into that moment, starting with material you've heard before in the wrong key and searching for the right one. Found. Again, this modulation dispenses with caution. You get on an express elevator and you skip all the floors in between. The very steady tempo of the 16ths we've been hearing ceases, interrupted by an explicit instruction to hold back. Resume tempo. Time is put on pause, resuming only when we're safely heading to A flat major. Once back in the right key, we stay put. But I want to look at the coda, the very end of the movement. It will transport us forward and backward in time, allowing us to reflect on what's been and what's to come. Listen to the ongoing 16ths, merged here with the opening tune. It's hiding in a new register in the left hand. That tune in the left hand is like a memory recurring, but fragmentary and distant. And finally, in the last measures, you heard another inner voice saying something very important. This is what it had to say. That inner voice is hinting at the subject of the great fugue to come. Listen now to the movement as a whole, hearing the journey of those many 16th notes, the spinning of theme after theme, the modulations that convey you from one universe to another, the registers that sparkle, shriek, boom, and snarl. You'll undoubtedly experience Musil's refuge from chaos. This movement is really only the calm prelude to the coming saga, which is more complex, more fraught, and finally a vibrant testimony to art's narrative power. You'll hear how the story ends next time.